Good evening. My name's Mark Hayward. I'm a social justice activist in South Africa, and I'm also the editor of Maverick Citizen. Thank you for joining us this evening for the launch of the film Good Hope. We have with us this evening many of the people who feature in the film, doctors and activists and entrepreneurs and journalists and artists, and all who have a common thread, which is that they are people who are deeply invested in the future of South Africa. The film that we are here to launch is really a film about hope. And it's a film that aims to show that South Africa is a country that has many, many challenges, as do many countries in the world. But it is also a country that is probably as well equipped or better equipped than any other country in the world because of our diversity, our difference, our ability to innovate, our ability to imagine, and our ability to build better and more equal futures. I watched the film for the first time yesterday and this morning, and I hope that it'll be much more than just a cinematic experience. I hope that it will become part of the process to build South Africa along the lines dreamed of by Nelson Mandela and by many other of the people who fought and died for the free South Africa. So, Anthony, I'm interested in what made you want to make this film. There's many films about South Africa, about our struggle to overcome apartheid, about what has happened in the 26 years since we got our freedom. What's different about this film? What's driving you? Why is it relevant? What are you after?
Gosh, I'll try and keep that brief because there are lots of answers to that question. But in simple terms, my relationship with South Africa began 20 years ago when I discovered the story of Sandra Lang, which became my first feature film, Skin. And that helped me to develop a very profound understanding of this country's history and its past. And there developed in me an urge, a desire to do something that maybe talked about what was happening now, because I feel that a lot of cinema in South Africa in particular focuses too much on the past and too much on the apartheid era and not on what I feel is happening on the ground right now. So the first instinct was the desire to do something contemporary. And then what made the specific idea of this was that I had been told for the last 20 years of my relationship with South Africa that it was all going to go to the dogs and that it was all a disaster story. But every time I went back to South Africa, I saw growth, I saw development, I saw good things happening. And I met extraordinary young people who I found very inspiring. So ultimately, this film for me was an exploration of why the narrative of the country seemed to be so pessimistic in the face of what I could see was huge potential.
In a sense, it's a film by which you hope to inspire hope, to give people a sense of their power and agency to build the South Africa we dreamed about.
Well, I think a lot of the people on the panel here, they're part of the Good Hope ethos, if you like. And it isn't so much about inspiring hope as perhaps helping to see that the glass is half full, not necessarily half empty. It's about changing perception, because the film is not all sunshine news by any means. It's not saying it's all kumbaya and wonderful. It's saying there are problems, there are challenges, but there are also solutions. And those solutions are very often in the hands of these extraordinary contributors who are the future leaders of the country. So it's about reminding people that they must not just look down, they have to look up as well. They have to look out towards the future and what's coming down the pike. Because if it's in the hands of these people, actually the future looks pretty bright to me.
Great. Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng, welcome. It's lovely to see you. Many people in the audience will know you, many may not know you. A highly respected activist, sexual and reproductive health rights, a doctor. What do you think is the basis for hope? And you participated in this film. What messages do you think that it is important to carry forward out of this film?
Thanks, Mark, and hi to everyone. You know, for me, working in sexual and reproductive health and rights, you know, there's a lot of really tough times and tough days, you know, in the field. I remember being a young intern in the West End of Johannesburg, and at the time, you know, the issues of gender-based violence and femicide, as we see them being reported now, were not, you know, as visible in the media as they are now. And I remember then a very deep sense of helplessness, you know, and grief, you know, for the patients and the experiences that they were having at the time. And I think without hope, I don't think I could have been in this job, doing this work still. And it's finding those pockets of goodness and joy and hope, you know, for myself, for my patients and my community. And I think that's what keeps me going. It's that deliberate finding of joy, regardless of how hard things may be, but a real commitment though at the same time to change, you know, the structural and the root causes of what I see as negative health outcomes, right? But a lot of it actually, you know, requires structures and systems to work for people. And yeah, and I think for me, you know, it's been a while since we recorded, but it's kind of full circle because I'm now a commissioner at the Commission for Gender Equality. And every day when I go to my office, I walk past exactly where we filmed my interview at the, you know, female prison at Constitution Hill. So there is so much of this good hope thread everywhere I go, and literally every day when I go to work, I walk past that space. And I think I'm grateful, you know, for that consistent reminder of what hope can be for all of us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yusuf Randera Rees, a lot of the film, one of the big themes that runs throughout the film is the importance of South Africa's young people. You are a young person. You are an entrepreneur in an organization that seeks to build the capacity of young people to make people realize that they can give birth to their dreams. Tell me what you think are the messages of this film, and how you would like it to be seen and to shape our future.
Yeah, I think for me, the thing that on a daily basis makes me enthusiastic about the future of South Africa is the people living normal daily lives, and especially the entrepreneurs that I engage with. And it's not just young entrepreneurs across the spectrum. Just people leading and getting things done, and making their little micro economies work. And we talk a lot about liberating the potential of those people and supporting SMEs and supporting entrepreneurs. But I think one of the key determinants of whether South Africa is going to be successful in the next 10, 20 years is whether we really do commit to that, and whether we can get politics and government and bureaucracy out of the way and just let South Africans really build the country, or whether we're going to stick in the way of people. I felt that a little bit myself now with the COVID response, where I felt like I knew a lot of young entrepreneurs trying to contribute, and brilliant people who had great ideas and were building things and wanted to do things, and getting frustrated because they couldn't find a gap to really be allowed into the response. And so, yeah, I think that's a massive theme for me, is that I think we have a lot of the potential, and that's what the film says, and a lot of what people are saying, but it's not, I don't think we're anywhere near taking advantage of what we've got.
So we have this potential. We have to realize just how great our potential is, but we also just have to realize what a fabulous human resource base and traditions we have in this country. And that is partly what the film tries to demonstrate, and what everybody on this panel illustrates. Perhaps the last person for this segment, I can see her sitting there quietly, Judy Sikuza, a young person, the CEO of the Nelson Mandela, or the Mandela Rhodes Foundation, again, an organization, part of civil society that seeks to give birth to the South Africa that we dream of. You feature very prominently throughout the film. What's your message, and what do you think the film's message is?
Thank you, Mark. I think we're at a very important crossroad as a country. And I think we can see that COVID has really revealed some of the deep structural inequalities in our country. And a big part of, I think, what we're trying to grapple with as the Mandela Rhodes Foundation is really beginning to challenge the power structures that exist in our society. And we really need to find innovative ways to share power amongst the people in South Africa. I mean, you hear statistics like 90% of the wealth in South Africa is owned by 10% of the people. And I just don't think we can continue in that way. I mean, we can talk about the narrative of young people being the hope and the future, but as Yusuf says, we've got to loosen up the structures in the system. So I'm very encouraged by the young Mandela Rhodes scholars that I get to work with, because they really are trying to say, how do we pair up reconciliation with real reparations, where we can begin to fundamentally see a transformation in our society. And these young people, I mean, you've got a young Black woman studying space science and really trying to create new innovative ways of thinking about solving our problems. Our scholars are trying to reimagine how we structure our finance, and to say, we know we've got an economy that's about 60% informal, so how do we begin to provide services that allow for financial access for those who the formal structures won't allow. But to realize that by 2030, 75% of this continent is going to be under the age of 35. And so a crucial part is to say we really have to invest in the leadership of this continent. And I'm very excited and privileged to be sitting in an organization that's trying to do that. So I have hope, because I can see that these young people are imagining new structures and systems. And I think we are on a path towards that, if only we can really collectively come together and be willing to have the courage to challenge the current structures that are unequal.
Thank you very much, Judy. There's a lot of pessimists, there's a lot of naysayers in South Africa, there's a lot of naysayers about South Africa all over the world. The key message of this film is that the naysayers are unjustified, and that we need to shift that narrative. Nobesuthu, there you are. I can see you again now. You're a young person. You're an entrepreneur. You're a person who's made a go of life and made a go of business. How do you counter those messages, and how do you deal with those messages on a daily basis in South Africa in 2020 with all of the challenges that we face today?
I mean, I'm in the fashion industry, and really it's a really optimistic point of view that we're existing in right now, because the opportunities are just bountiful. Over the 12 years, we've had over 70 designers coming into our business. And I think for me, that would have never been seen in the times of apartheid. That would have never been a possibility that would have even existed for those 70 designers who are 90% Black, and they're actually exposed to a platform that is, you know, enabled mass scale for them. And I think for me, that shows that, yes, we are progressing, even though it may be, you know, it's small steps, but ultimately we are definitely moving forward. This would have never been possible before our time.
Yeah, and I think people often forget just how much we have achieved. I mean, South Africa in 2020 is like a different planet from South Africa in 1994. There's a great deal still to achieve, and that's what this film is about. But we've come a long way, but we have to focus on areas where we've failed. Adrienne Basson, you're somebody who's looked into the darker parts of our recent history, the struggles against corruption, as somebody who's as a frontline journalist, as an editor. What do you think? How do we deal with pessimism? How do we push it aside? But at the same time remain realistic about the challenges that we face, and making sure that ours is a society that includes all 57 or 8 million people in its economy, in its politics, and so on and so on.
Thank you, Mark, and good evening, everyone. It's nice to be here and see all of your faces in this strange time. I think, Mark, that it is a question I often get is how do you remain optimistic if you're a journalist, if you're confronted with all these stories every day, if you see the corruption at cold face, if you see how money that's supposed to be going into poverty upliftment and job creation goes into buying Mercedes-Benzes and big houses. I mean, just in the past week, we saw some very expensive motorcycle scooters being bought in what is clearly a dodgy transaction in the Eastern Cape in the midst of a national health crisis. I think what makes me positive is that, that we still have many whistleblowers in our institutions working alongside activists and journalists to unearth this wrongdoing in government and in the private sector. You know, I'm always amazed by the bravery of people inside government institutions, inside private companies, coming forward, helping us with documents, giving us interviews to expose the wrongdoing. So that gives me hope. I think there's a lot of good people in this country. I've always maintained that there's many more good people in this country than the amount of people who want to drag us down through corruption, racism, etc. And just maybe a second point to that, of course, one of the other arguments that I often see, and this is an interesting discussion I had a few years ago with Professor Xolela Manku, was around racism and corruption. I unfortunately see and hear too often that when people are being accused of racism, they say, but what about the corruption? And the vice versa, if people are being accused of corruption, they often say, but what about the racists? And I'm afraid we don't have the luxury to choose one over the other. We have to simply deal constructively and determinedly with both those issues, with corruption and racism. And these things are often going hand in hand. Thank you.
And are you satisfied in a word or two words that we are doing that?
Yes and no. I think we are brave in the discussions we're having. If I look at the discussions going on in the United States at the moment in the wake of George Floyd's death and in the wake of the Black Lives Matter discussion, I think we as a country are having those robust discussions. We are not afraid to have those discussions. We've been having them for the past probably 5 to 8 years. I think the Fees Must Fall and the Roads Must Fall movement encourage us to have a lot of those discussions that we started having. In terms of corruption fighting, I'm not always so optimistic that we are doing as best as we could. There has been some changes in the institutions fighting, leading that fight against corruption, but I'm sure like most of you, I'm still waiting for the first arrests and successful prosecutions.
Right. Zama Mbele, you're a psychologist. That puts you on another of South Africa's front lines. I think the deputy chairperson of the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. There's a lot of depression in South Africa. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of despair. How do you square this message of hope and agency that is being carried by this film with the realities of our life in this country?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question and the invitation to everybody that is here. I think that there's several points to make. I mean, to a large extent, I want to reiterate to some degree my point in the clip, that we're not surprised, actually, of the trajectory that we find ourselves in, to the extent that this happens in very many different circumstances, and to a huge degree, we expected it to happen in South Africa. We expected to some extent to see a surge in what is a protective mania or a protective optimism that allows us, in fact, to bear through a very difficult stage. However, we also then expected that almost like cheap gasoline to run out at a point. And then we were going to be set with this depression. Now, the good news is that we do not have to sit here for forever as a nation and as a country. We do not have to sit with the great deals and levels of anxiety and depression, which were high before the COVID crisis, though of course, as we all appreciate now, are incredibly high as well. We can attend to it. And how we attend to it is exactly this, is that we do look at it, and we're quite direct about the fact that we will achieve a good level of optimism if we pay enough attention to what is also not going wrong, what is not going right, if we pay enough attention to that, what is pervasively dragging us down, then we attend to it and we deal with it. And that's how we're going to move on and move forward. And my analysis of not just kind of the clinical, I suppose, palette of where the country is and the nation, but also just the general feel is that, in fact, we're doing well. You know, we shouldn't be frightened with knowing how bad things are, because to a huge extent, that's how we're going to help get them better too, as well.
Kavisha Pillay is a young activist. She works for an organization called Corruption Watch. Kavisha, tell us what you think about corruption, and particularly about the bearing that corruption has on young people's hopes and dreams and opportunities in our country.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for featuring me in this discussion. Unfortunately, and linked to the sort of discussion before, is that young people are feeling quite pessimistic about the state of corruption in South Africa. Coincidentally, Corruption Watch has just concluded a study with young people and their perceptions of corruption, and the overwhelming majority of young people are concerned about the state of corruption in the country. They believe that it's become normalized to pay a public official in order to get a basic service. The majority of people believe that the levels of corruption in this country are extremely high. They think that over the last 5 years, corruption has gotten worse, and they have a very pessimistic view of the future, and they think that corruption in the next 5 years is going to increase. So, that is the view, and despite the sort of efforts of this administration, young people are not hopeful about corruption. And probed with when probed further, young people believe that corruption sort of stands in the way of them accessing opportunities, and where people want a sort of small percentage of the respondents paid a bribe previously to get a job. A higher percentage of respondents noted that they would pay a bribe in future in order to get a job. And that has to sort of be linked to the high youth unemployment rates in the country. So, there is this, whilst the current administration has done a bit to address the sort of grand corruption in the country, it's the sort of petty acts of corruption, the normalized behaviors that's become a culture, and that's what's I think upsetting young people. But just sort of in closing, I think that even though there is this pessimism, we have a lot of work cut out. All of us here have a lot of our work cut out for us, because at the root of young people rising up all over the world and displaying their acts of anger, at the bottom of that anger is the need for hope. There's a hope for a just and more equal world. So even though there's this sort of state of pessimism in the way we look at our country at the moment, I think that there is a lot going on in order to try and improve that.
Thank you very much, Kavisha. So yes, it's a challenge, but we've also, as I think you said, seen a major movement in this country. There's an awareness about corruption that didn't exist a decade ago, and there are people fighting corruption. Musi Maimane, you've recently created a new movement, a citizens movement called One South Africa. You've been very vocal. You're a young leader. How do you tie these threads together? Corruption, optimism, people's power and agency, opportunity. A few of your thoughts, please.
No, there's a lot, and thank you and good evening to everybody, and I hope you've had a great Youth Day. The thought that has struck me as well, I've been listening to the conversation, is something is good or bad in comparison to something. Now, as a macro analysis of South Africa, you have to say to yourself, how bad or how well are we doing in comparison to what? I mean, I think you could say maybe in comparison to Zimbabwe, we're doing better, but if in comparison to, I think we need to put ourselves in the right league as South Africa. If you look at developing economies like Turkey, etc., you have to say, where are we in comparison to those countries, Chile, etc.? And when it comes to the question of the rule of law, then I think there's something, despite the complication that we face, there's something to be welcome about the fact that you can have a former president of a country actually appearing in court. This is not something that we should take for granted. It's a significant, whilst you might fight the case against Jacob Zuma, when the judges say he must show up, he does show up and he will face the music. Whereas this doesn't happen in other countries. In fact, in many other African states, this challenge doesn't take place. In Turkey, as an example, Erdogan's own actions, they have taken a different perspective. So I think there's a dynamic upon which we must rank ourselves appropriately. But at the same time, I think all of us as South Africans feel we could have been much better than where we are now, because the opportunities were before us. And so I think there is an internal sense of hopelessness, if I could call it that, that says we could have been. And I certainly think amongst education, we've got a challenge. I think certainly amongst execution of institutional decisions, we have a massive challenge. And I think our political system is due reform. Because frankly, I think that if you're gonna, the politics hasn't helped that sense of hopefulness, because I think politicians thrive on division, not on being able to always unite citizens and then actually encourage a vision for the future. So as I sit here, Mark, on June 16, I think that I feel like comparative to other nations in our same league, we could say we've done relatively okay, but internally, I think I can't help but feel that we've missed some major opportunities to really accelerate the advantage that we started off with.
I think everybody would agree with you, Musi, that we stare the inequalities in the face on a day-to-day basis. We stare unemployment in the face on a day-to-day basis. We stare the health crisis. We stare the education crisis. But as you say, there are things we can be proud of. And I think one of the people who's best shown us the importance of the Constitution, we're very fortunate she joined us just a couple of minutes ago, who's a hero amongst the many heroes of our panel this evening is Thuli Madonsela. Professor Madonsela, former public protector. We just talked a little bit about corruption and its relationship with hope and agency and equality and opportunity. You feature quite a lot in the film. You featured in the film quite a lot because you featured large in South Africa. What are your thoughts looking forward on these questions?
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, dear colleagues. And I apologize that I could only join now. Firstly, I would agree with Ms. Maimane that when it comes to the rule of law, we're doing quite well. And we have to thank the architects of our Constitution for foreseeing some of the troubles that we've gone through, because the very fact that we have a public protector and other Chapter 9 institutions reinforced in the manner they are is because of the foresight of the architects of our Constitution. And among those architects, we must also acknowledge the Constitutional Court, because when the constitutional judgment took place, the Constitutional Court judges realized that the protections were not as good as they needed to be, and we got those. I do think, though, that we can't afford to be complacent. We can't, as an athlete, you judge yourself by your own capabilities and what you have the potential to achieve. And much as we have, of course, a duty to consider ourselves as part of the African continent and the developing world, I think we have a higher duty than many of these countries. We have a country where people have suffered a lot, where people have hoped a lot. I spoke earlier today at 2 different events about the cues of hope versus the cues of despair that we have now. And part of the reason we have the cues of despair is unethical conduct. And in this case, it's not even about theft. It's the unethical conduct of appointing people above their competence, who are not able to set up proper machinery, because part of good governance, for example, is the ability to manage a disaster. And as we speak right now, the people who have not received any food parcel, who haven't received any financial help, not because these facilities have dried up, just because the management system is not good enough. So when we look forward at navigating the future, we will have to go beyond just being concerned about corruption and be concerned about the ability to govern for a state that is founded on social justice. Our preamble says that we commit ourselves to establish a democratic state, a state that is founded on democratic values, social justice, the rule of law, and human rights. And we'll have to make sure that those who govern know that that's their first duty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, to Lizzie. But let me turn to Janet, first of all. Works for an NGO, a funder called the D.G. Murray Trust, that's particularly working to improve our education systems from an early stage in learners' lives. Janet, is diversity a strength at the moment for South Africa, or do we often turn it into a weakness? And much as you and Yusuf and others may point to the racism of our country, its historical legacy, as something that we are capable of overcoming, and I believe we all believe that we are, have we done enough? And is it not still a blight that holds us back, and that actually prevents the hope that we keep talking about in this film?
Yeah, Mike, I think we've got a long way to go in facing ourselves and facing each other as South Africans. I think particularly white South Africans having to come to the table in a really powerful, meaningful way to truly face what we have done, and to face the legacy of what we have done as a collective. And I think that is work that really must be done in order for us to be able to truly step into the power of our diversity. I think as long as we have these really painful wounds that are not seen and acknowledged, we can't move towards healing. I think there's such power in just the acknowledgement. I often sort of get trapped in these debates about whether we should have white guilt, and I like to say, well, we should certainly have white acknowledgement. At the very least, we should certainly be willing. I thought, the previous comment about looking deep into the fire, looking at our wounds, looking at the pain, and really being able to speak into it. And as I've learned, certainly with Judy, is and to build relationship in the midst of the fire, to find ways in which you are so enmeshed with each other that you cannot walk away when it becomes hard. And I think part of the struggle of South Africa is that although our lives are very enmeshed across class and race, often those are transactional relationships, and we haven't yet built the relationships in every single person's life in ways in which we're truly enmeshed, so that you don't have the option to leave the conversation or to demonize, or to just throw away the possibility that lies on the other side of the fire, and on the other side of the really hard work of coming to terms with what it is to live in this very traumatized place and what we have done to each other, not just during apartheid. I think South Africa is a very unique country with our slave, sort of the story of slavery in South Africa is often an unacknowledged story. The real hundreds of years of colonialism, not just the apartheid era, and all of those stories are ones we have to sit with, and we have to be willing to see each other and see ourselves in them, and then find this beautiful, beautiful hope and possibility that lies on the other side of that.
Yeah, there's somewhere in the film where somebody says, I can't remember who, but being human means to be seen. And I think one of the challenges in our country is that we lose sight of our neighbors frequently. We make people invisible. Mike van Graan and Kagiso Ladiga, you're both what we call creatives. You work in the arts, you write plays, comedy. How can you teach us to see ourselves? Should we laugh more about ourselves possibly in order to understand ourselves more deeply. Kagiso, do you want to just comment to begin with, and then I'll ask Mike to say a few words on this issue as well.
Yeah, well, hello everybody. Yeah, I mean, I just think to Janet's point now, I think we moved too quickly through the inconvenient narrative. You know, there's a lot of people would feel guilty, a lot of people would feel angry and so on. And I think we kind of decided, let's get on with being a country. Let's get on with economy and building roads and all of that kind of stuff. But I think now what we have is we're missing that narrative, you know, the big part that makes us a collective culture, like that gives us the collective narrative where you know, where somebody says the good old days and we can talk about it and they don't have to run out of the room immediately after saying that. What good old days? Where? You know, it's like we like that. You know, when a plane takes off and lands and the kid screams because of the pressure in the air and all of that, but they don't know why. They don't know. Nobody's told. You know, I feel like because we kind of buried these facts and these truths about ourselves and we've moved on, we kind of have these crazy problems that can be sorted out by talking about them, by telling the story, by presenting them and talking about it, by, you know, where the kid walks around and understands that it's not by choice that all the black people are maids and then all the managers and Old Mutual or whatever are these white guys. This is what happened. Because in 50 years time or 20 years time, if we don't tell the story and we don't run away from the story, that's going to be how the world works for people. You're going to be like, of course, white people know how to work on brains and black people know how to clean streets, you know? So for me, it's like that. I feel like this movie is a great, like, a thing. It's a sort of a coach to kind of go, hey, you can do it, get out there and be positive. But I feel like what we need to do is we need to not be afraid to tell the story. We need to look at each other in the eye and talk about it until we don't feel these things anymore, you know, until we are comfortable enough to continue in a more mature way.
Mike, 38 plays or something like that, a prolific writer and commentator on the South African condition. Tell us your thoughts briefly.
Well, you know, I've often said that as a citizen and as a parent, to be in this country is quite a challenge, but as a playwright, it's a complete and utter gift, because in our work, we kind of look for contradiction, for irony, for complexity, and for nuance. And I've also said, just in relation to your earlier question, you know, we kind of live in that Gramscian paradox of the optimism of the will on the one hand and the pessimism of the intellect. With our intellects, we can understand that, you know, there are major challenges in this country, but because we're alive, that very act of being alive is an act of optimism. And I think that for me, you know, this movie has kind of just blown me away, because I guess I come from an older generation where we might be a little bit more cynical about things. And in this, I work a lot with younger people, and you know, Mark, Daniel Richards, and I've been working with Nancy Sekokwani recently on a new one-person show. Just blown away by the incredible talent in this country. But then what makes me pessimistic is on Sunday night, a young dancer, 28 years old, is murdered, is stabbed to death by a young girl half his age. So 2 lives just completely messed up, and that shouldn't be happening in our country. But for me, there is hope. And, you know, maybe a few years ago, I would have been showing people the movie Miners Shot Down about the Marikana massacre. Right now, I'll be showing them this movie, because it's been the people in this movie that have actually really been quite inspirational. So I just want to say thank you to my colleagues featured here and those who aren't here, just for giving me hope, because at times when I feel like in despair, you know, this is the kind of movie to go back to and feel hopeful again. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Lisa Klein, you are successful, you're a leader in business, but aren't you in many ways the exception? And isn't the terrible violence against women, gender-based violence, inequality in almost every sphere of life, isn't that in some ways a counter to the themes and the narrative that Good Hope is trying to put across in this film?
Yeah, Mark, it's an interesting point you raised. I think it was L.B. Sachs who said that sexism, in fact, is the only non-racial institution in this country. Maybe it wasn't like that. I think maybe it was patriarchy. And I think that probably in many ways still stands, that across the board, whatever community you come from, wherever you are, I think that there's a profound degree of patriarchy and sexism that still runs through and courses through the kind of blood of our nation. And in many ways, I think that I've been very lucky, actually. I've been lucky in many senses that the kind of sexist slights that I've encountered are nothing compared to what a lot of other people have. And maybe that also comes from the privileged position you're in. It comes from also a lot of inherited privileges. Just the way that you are as an individual, your ability to deal with sexism as well, I think gives you a lot of privilege. But one thing that I have found encouraging, I would say, is in the last few months, I've been very involved in Business for South Africa, which has been business organizations coming together to try and deal with the COVID pandemic. And one quite amazing thing has been the number of women leaders. In fact, the number of women who have across business and in fact in government too and civil society who have taken a leadership role. And it's something a number of us have been quite excited about and in fact quite proud about. Is I'm not sure why at this moment, what it is about crisis where these women have stood up, but that's something that gives me hope. This real sense of women being able to take a leadership role across the board. And so, I think in terms of what all my co-panelists have spoken about, in terms of a lot of it is about the power of attitude, I think, and the power of framing. And I think it's about if we try and see things through this optimistic as opposed to through this negative bias, we will invest in this country. I think that we will encourage entrepreneurs, we will build businesses, we will fight, I think, for our institutions. And that's something someone said earlier, that optimism and fighting is about optimism and is about activism. And that is something where I'm very proud to be on this panel because there are so many activists and so many fighters.
Thank you very much, Lisa, much appreciated. Dr. Mofokeng, your message and how do you think we should understand this as we think about the challenges of South Africa's future?
Mark, I think a lot of what needs to happen is to realize that unless we center the people in the margins, we are still not going to have a South Africa where people feel that it's also theirs. If you think of, people like sex workers who are, experiencing state-sanctioned violence because of criminalization. If you think of the women who are being arrested for selling acha just to try and put food on the table during COVID-19, right? Whereas institutions and franchises continue to work. And it shows you that even in the planning, even in disaster and non-disaster times, we still don't think far enough about people who are already living in the margins, who don't have 8 or 9 weeks to wait, for 350 rand stipend for relief. A lot of the problems in South Africa are urgent. A lot of them are about survival, right? And in my work as a medic, as an advocate, for women's rights, it's very important because a lot of our disempowerment, a lot of what makes women not thrive, it's still very much structural and systemic issues. And yet when young girls are visibly pregnant in schools, they become centered as the problem, not the rapists who are raping children. We then focus on pregnant bellies and make the problem an individual failure of Black girls and not a problem of patriarchy, lack of consequences, and of rape. So I think a lot of my work and what gives me hope is to try, and center all of these different people and all of these different narratives so that they inform policy, so that they inform program design, so they inform what the future of this country should be, because they have a really a profound lived experience that many people who are leading can't even imagine. And it's those people, I think, who should be leading and who should be in the center of all of our imagination for South Africa.
So it's back to the people that we make invisible, centering the people in the margins, because the values of our new South Africa says everyone has a right to dignity. Everyone has a right to equality. Everyone has a right to life. And that perhaps will be the greatest measure of whether we have moved away from a society that kept women and Black people and migrants out on the margins of society. But crucial to our ability to do that is perhaps an area where we have failed the most up to this point. And it's an area where we need a message of hope, and where I think that we need to see more examples. Dr. Mofokeng has led in how we can bring about change in relation to gender-based violence, that we can change, we can bring about improvements. I want us to reflect now for a few minutes on education, which is another aspect of the film, and then I'm going to talk to some real pioneers. So Unathi, where do you think, I mean, education is that little front line of the school in Bishu that you work with, but it's a big front line for the country as a whole, because it's the key to our dreams, to equality. What would your message be? What do you think we should be doing? Do we need 5,000 more Unatis in 10,000 more schools, or what is the formula that we're missing?
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you so much, Anthony, as well for the invite. So a couple of years ago, I would have put up that line and said, you know, education is the equalizer and, you know, enabler. But as a recent example first, just from COVID-19, it's clearly in the last 4 weeks, we have schools that have unequal access to online learning, which has been like sort of like a default measure to catch up in the curriculum. So one, there are layers into fixing the system, and you definitely don't need 500 Unatis. The problem is structural. The work that we're doing is in the intervention space. So interventions are important, but we need to acknowledge that the problem is structural. So it starts at the top, the structuring of the curriculum, getting equal access for learners who are coming from rural and township communities to have the same opportunities that a child would be coming from a private school or quintile 4 and 5 school is having as well. So our work primarily right now is to enable learners who are coming from disadvantaged communities to get at least that quality education as they're transitioning between schooling and tertiary education. And we do that by going deep in the rural areas where I come from. I'm originally from the Eastern Cape, and I had the privilege to get scholarships from as early as grade 8, right up until the University of Cape Town. And the work that we are doing is probably like 1% of what needs to be fixed in the education system. And we're primarily focusing on access to quality higher learning education and providing the maths, science, and all these tutorship programs so that the learners who are from those communities can get that equal access. And then just the last parting point for me, what gives me hope is that despite of all of these challenges, despite the lack of resources, not having toilets, ECOMAN, not having teachers, right, for 6 months in maths and science, there are learners who thrive, who do their best beyond the lack of resources to get the marks, to get that access to those high learning institutions. But the main point is that the challenge is structural and it cannot be solved by intervention programs.
But the intervention programs remain important to give hope, because
100%.
Giving hope to a few people gives opportunity, and that in itself helps us to build the power to deal with the structural changes that we need to make. Do you think, 100%. Just very briefly before I move on to Jevron and ask the same question, Unathi, do you think we've given education in our country the priority that it requires to bring about freedom and equality for particularly these people we're talking about on the margins, the people who've been left invisible in rural areas and so on?
From a financial perspective, when you look at our country's budget, you would assume that we've given it a priority. But as Professor Matonsela, I think, mentioned earlier on, it's also about having the right people at the right places, right, to place that priority, because it's more than just the financial resources that are needed, right? It's also having the right people at the right places to execute whatever the vision that we have as a country is for our education system for those learners in the rural and township communities.
So the innovators, the entrepreneurs, the dreamers, the inspirers, we need them in the education system, helping to make this structural change. Jevron, you are, I think, one of those innovators, and you explained in that little clip we saw part of what it is that motivates you. I didn't know your granddad, unlike the people I have known in this, but can you say a few words just about what you're doing and how it links to the themes of this film of agency and hope and a better future?
I think it's difficult listening to the comments and the discussion so far. I feel like no matter what, I'm riding on a unicycle, juggling glasses. So I think the reality is, I started a group of schools, and I started a group of schools because I went to 13 different schools, diagnosed with functioning Asperger syndrome. And I think for me, what stood out was that the fabric of our education system was built for a world that no longer exists. So I look at what's happened now with COVID-19, and I look at how most organizations have been able to transition onto sort of the digital frontier. If education isn't built for the digital frontier, how are we ever meant to transition onto it? So I think South Africa is in a strange place where we have the ability to carve our own narrative for education. And I think we should actually go back to the core and say, well, it's one thing fixing education, but then there's another thing fixing teacher training. Are educators trained to teach for purpose? Do they understand the purpose of sort of acquiring knowledge? Do they understand knowledge transition? Do we understand the purpose of numeracy, literacy, and logic? And if we're not training our educators correctly, then why are we trying to fix our education system? So I think that if I was so brave to say, I look at our organization, we have private schools. And then in my night job, I'm the chief operating officer of a university or a tertiary institution that's been in existence for 50 years. It's a non-profit organization that taught Black theologians that there was no difference between white and Black people. So I think for me, I look at it from a systemic perspective and say that the world has to change, education has to change. And yes, there are a lot of factors within our society that have obviously led us to the position that we are now, but we are in a beautiful position where we can carve out our own narrative and, in South Africa specifically, and re-look at education as a whole, of the purpose of education, the subjects that we teach, and, where are these children going to end up one day. So yeah, that's it from me.
Thank you very much. And I'll pick up on what you said, carve out our own narrative. And COVID-19 and the crisis that it presents us with, which is particularly acute in education and will be, as Unati has also said, gives us no choice but to carve that narrative going forward from today. It adds urgency to everything that we have been talking about. The film ends on a message of hope. If you watch the film, you'll see that it ends with stories and depictions about many of the panelists that we've been with tonight and about their work, which doesn't give a false hope or an abstract hope, but which actually provides positive evidence, proof of the power that we have as individuals in our society to change our society for the better. I think anybody with us tonight can also take comfort from the fact that for those of us who are slightly older, we 26 years down this democracy journey. Many of us were there even in the days before the democracy journey, and we're still relatively bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and energetic and up for this struggle. This is a country that we are capable of changing, and it's unique in the world in that respect. So I just want to ask whether there's any final comments from any of the panelists or from Anthony himself.
My very quick comment that I want to make is that when I started making this film, it was at the height of Zuma's corruption, when people felt incredibly pessimistic about South Africa. And then there was, if you like, that Ramaphoria that came when Cyril became president, which didn't last very long. And now there's COVID-19. So there's always some challenge that's going to make people feel pessimistic and depressed about whatever's happening. And I just want to point out that you guys, you always get through it. Whatever the challenge is, whether it's Zuma, whether it's COVID, you will get through this. So it's really about looking forwards to the next stage. Yes, how do we deal with the COVID crisis now? But then what happens after it's over, and how can we create a better world when it's done?
Nobasutu, I see
Yeah.
you.
I mean, diversity for me is actually our superpower. When I look at this panel, we're a diverse group of people from races to gender. And, you know, if as South Africans, we tap into that, but also the individual work that we need to do on our own. And there's a huge opportunity to almost, I don't know, I mean, for lack of a better term, almost build some structures around how do we do inner work, the self-esteem issues, the self-confidence, the self-belief. And I think if everyone can do that, and if we can get that right, you know, there can be a much better situation for all of us.
So Judy, I saw you raising your hand.
Thanks, Mark. I mean, I think Nobasutu nailed it. And the kind of the right hand to that is psychologically, you look at us as a country, we're 26 years old, right? And so we're beginning to mature and become adults. And part of what that journey means is what work do we actually have to do to build? I mean, my wife and I have a 13-month-old who is, featured in film. And, I think about the future that I want to see her live in. And so I think I recognize at a bigger philosophical level that I love this country. I love the potential of who we are, but we've got to do the work. And sometimes it's hard because it's exhausting. We're trying to pull people who aren't seeing each other's humanities. And as those of us who are sitting as leaders, we are tasked with that, I think, big task of helping us see each other's humanity so that we can believe that this country can be the country we want to live in. So we've got to do the work, guys. We've got to pull our boots up. We know we've got the resources. We know we've got the talent. And I think as Advocate Thuli Madonsela said, ultimately, are we living to our potential? And I think all of us know we can if we can put the work in. But I'm hopeful that South Africa has the ability to step into its potential. And I'm really privileged to be with you all here and encouraged by the work you do in your different sectors.
Thank you very much, Judy. Advocate Madonsela, you keep on being mentioned. Anything you'd like to say to us?
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to the colleagues. But just firstly, I would like to say thank you to Anthony for this groundbreaking work. It's giving us a mirror to look at ourselves in terms of our challenges and our potential. It's also a good conversation starter. I remember a movie that was made a few years ago called Beyond the River. It was a great conversation starter, but I think the mistake we made, we didn't create conversations such as this one to discuss it and then ask ourselves, what next then? And I do hope that we're going to get young people who are a constituency that both my team at Stellenbosch University Social Justice Trust and at the Tuma Foundation think are an important section of society to have these kinds of conversations. And I hope we'll have those conversations. And I do see it as having the potential to get us to discuss those difficult conversations. We do have to undo the walls we've built around us. There is hope for the society envisaged in the Constitution, but it can only come about if we break those walls and we do those conversations. And like Judy, I'm in a relationship that would never have been contemplated under apartheid. But you realize when you get into this relationship and you get into other communities and say, oh God, we're just all human with the same pain, the same aspirations, the same concerns as each other. But we need to have these conversations to find each other. And we also need to have these conversations around who should govern us and what qualifies them to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Advocate Madonsela. And thank you to all of the members of the panel for each of your contributions, because in your different ways, visible, less visible, invisible, you're keeping hope alive. You're keeping the Constitution alive. You're showing the possibility of this dream that I think we all subscribe to. This film that Anthony and you have given us is it's a reflection on a journey, but it's also a marker of where we are on that journey. But what I think is unusual is that it's not a film that is about a dead past. It's a film that is about shaping the future that we are all hoping to live in. And I think what we've seen in the discussions that we've had tonight is this question of the diversity, the strengths of South Africa. And as Thuli said, you know, we need these conversations, but I think just the 17 people who have been on this panel here today, we're all pushing for the same thing. And at this point, we all still believe in the same thing. So I want to thank everybody who's come this evening. This evening has been, in a sense, an effort to strengthen and stimulate conversations, not to bring to an end conversations. And I think Anthony will agree that if the film does that, the film will have succeeded. So Anthony, I'm going to ask you as the director, the writer, whether there's anything you want to say in conclusion. And other than that, I'm going to wish everybody well, strength, health, and the ability to be your best in the difficult days and months that are going to confront our society immediately. But Anthony, you can have the last words for this evening.
Well, obviously, I want to thank absolutely everybody who's here and everyone who took part in the film. Thank you for continuing to support the film, because it's not enough to make a film. It has to be seen, it has to be heard about, it has to be shared. And I really hope that you will continue to help me to share this film with others, because as Thuli Madonsela said, it's about starting these conversations and continuing to have these conversations.
Thank you, everybody. Good luck and strength and power to you all and to all those people who have joined us tonight. We will see each other in the trenches tomorrow. Thank you. Good night. Bye-bye.